Hey guys, welcome to this video where we're going to be covering the process of applying color to the previous exercise you've been working on with the value application. Um, and we're going to use that value application to help kind of infuse the color within our scene. So we have our exercise here right now. We have all of our values already set up in here. We went through and created a little bit of atmospheric perspective in the value of some of these forms, but we're also going to make sure to incorporate a little bit of that into our color scheme in here as well. I have all of my previous layers and stuff in here, but for now, just to make my file a little cleaner, I'm actually going to come in and save this as a new file. I think it's always important to save files out in iterations so that if you ever corrupt a file or you lose information, you can go back to the previous one a little bit easier. So I'm going to go to 2-point perspective color demo. So now this is a new file on its own. And I can start getting rid of things that I don't need in here. For example, these vanishing points, I'm probably not going to need in this file. And if I ever need them, I can always go back to that older file, bring them into this file if I need to. So everything in here is looking pretty good for what I need with regards to my forms, my horizon line. I have my sky set up. I have my gray ground set up in there. I'm not going to need probably my lines in here either. And at this point, I'm ready to start thinking about color. Now, this is very important that you followed this sort of organizational method in the previous steps of your exercise. And most specifically, this is really the important part, guys. You want to have your lines separated. So for example, we're going to look at this front cylinder here. You can see I have my lines on a layer. I have highlights on their own layer. In fact, you can see I have 2 sets of highlights in here because of the way I wanted to work with them. You can get that more organized if you want, and you can do, for example, cylinder 1, highlights, create a group to keep everything organized because that is super important. I've touched on it a lot throughout the month, and it's something that you will continue to see in pretty much all the software packages you work in. I have my shadow group right here as well. I have my flat group right here as well, and then I have a cast shadow here as well. And I want to just turn off those highlights. It looks like there, let me just make sure I turn off the shadow. Yeah, okay. There isn't another extra highlight layer in there. All right, this is the flat background gray so that my cylinder isn't transparent. You're generally going to want to have that as well, but our color will take care of a lot of that for us. And then I have my cast shadow underneath it. So this ordering of layers is very, very helpful for a lot of things we're going to be doing. The other thing that's very important is this. You have to make sure that your shadow layers are a multiply and that your highlight layers are overlays. You can also switch probably to a soft light. You can play around with these guys in here for your highlights. And theoretically, you can do the same for your shadow with regards to all of these, the darken, multiply, color burn, linear burn. All of these will work on shadows pretty effectively. But I would just suggest sticking to a multiply and an overlay. And this is very important for the color application because those shadows will end up affecting what's underneath. And in fact, I'll just do this cylinder really quick to show you guys. You can see I have cylinder flat there. Right above it, I'm going to place cylinder color. And in fact, I can do this one of 2 ways. I can either, for example, take my cylinder flat here. I'm just going to hold Control and select it. So I'm within the pixels of that layer. And right now I could just paint bucket in, for example, let's say I wanted my cylinder to be a red, right? Let's just stick with the reds right now. I'm going to go with something a little bit darker and less saturated. I highly suggest stay away from this top right corner. You want to move down away from that. That is too intensely bright and saturated. So let's say I go even with this kind of bright red in here. I'm just going to paint bucket it in. And again, guys, this is the important part. By the way, I just deselected by hitting Control D. You can also come up to here and go to Select, Deselect right there. But you can see now that my highlights, if I start color sampling in here, my highlights are going to be lighter reds. If I go to my shadows, they're going to be darker reds, right? Instead of, for example, if I took my cylinder shadow and made it a normal, at some point in here, these are just going to turn into grays, right? So you want to make sure that you maintain your shadow layers as multiplies and your highlight layers as overlays. If you haven't done that yet, you're going to want to go through and fix that before you start applying color. Now, the next step of this is actually to pick a color scheme. Now, I started out with this red, but you don't want to just throw random colors in there. So for this activity, we specified that you have to pick between 3 different color schemes. I believe the options were analogous, complementary, and triadic, if I remember correctly. We will here, I'm probably going to work within a complementary color scheme. And in fact, I don't actually want to work with a red. I'm actually going to work within that color scheme that you see in golden hour when the sunset's coming down. I want a color scheme that's going to have warm and blues in it. So I'm going to go with a complementary color scheme. And specifically, I want to get into the orange, yellows, and blues and purples. So The first thing I'm actually going to do is find that color scheme. Now, I can do that a couple of different ways. You saw in a previous video that we used Adobe color themes, excuse me. So if you go to Window and you go to the extensions and you just open up your Adobe color themes over here, we have color rules in here that we can just use to pick our color schemes, right? So if I know I want my main color, for example, to be something in a bright orange, and then I just change my, where is it, right here, color rule. You can see right now it's set to analogous, so this would be a good analogous color scheme, but I wanted to go with complementary, right? So here's my oranges and my blues, right? Now, maybe I don't want them as saturated, so I might bring it in slightly, right? So it's not as intense, and then I can play individually with some of the blues in here if I want as well, but that would probably be a pretty good start, right? So I can use this as a basis, and I can just kind of switch between any of these colors that I want as I want to paint. I can also put this in my swatches if I want to. Let's just save it to my themes. I'm just going to save it right now. And then if I go to my swatches, they should be, I believe, at the bottom of my swatches. Or wherever my themes are. There we go, my themes. So it's in there right now. Anyways, and in fact, I can just go back to it and color sample it if I need it. Now, the other option would be something that I kind of prefer to do because I think it gives you a little bit more of a natural effect myself. So what I would suggest is actually going online and finding a complementary color scheme in a photo, right? So I can actually go into Google and just write complementary color. Let's just go with photo, right? And let's go to images and see kind of what comes up, right? We're going to get a lot of different complementary intense color schemes in here, but I could pull something like this with these really nice intense colors. Or, like I had mentioned earlier, what I really want to do is I want to expand it slightly by going into golden hour photography. And golden hour is this time at sunset where we get, again, these really nice blues and purples and oranges and yellows. It's complementary colors just naturally in real life. I really like this image here, but what I want to do actually is let's do this. Let's, with our tools in our image search, let's make sure that we find large images. And then let's pick one of these that we think will work well. I actually really like this. There's not much in focus, which might actually help me in some ways because I'm not really looking for concrete parts of the image. I'm looking for the colors within it. So I'm actually going to copy image, and let's see if I can just kind of paste it into Photoshop. Edit, paste. There we go. The beauty of modern technology. So let's move this image to the top here. You could also, by the way, save this image to your computer, bring it into Photoshop. I just went about it this quick way, but if you prefer, you can also right-click on the image, go to Save Image As, save it wherever you want on your computer, like your desktop or your downloads, or probably actually where you have all this project information. I'm not going to navigate to that right now, but I'll just go with golden hour photo. And then, again, if you wanted to go about it this way, you can just go to File, Open. Let's go to my desktop. Where's my golden hour photo? And then to bring it in here, all you have to do is kind of bring this file over here. I'm going to get my Move tool out up here. This is the Move tool. You can hit V for it, and then just drag it in. And it'll end up in your image, right? So either of these work fine. Doesn't really matter. None of them are going to be different than the other. I'm just doing this for the sake of having a color scheme. So I could color sample this the way it is. But what I prefer to do with color schemes that I find is a little bit more helpful with regards to breaking them down so you don't get too focused on individual areas is I like to use a specific filter in Photoshop. If you go to Filter and you go to Filter Gallery, where is it? Right up here. There's a specific filter called the stained glass filter that you'll find in this distort area. Now I happen to already be in there. It may start you on somewhere in artistic or something like that. Let's go to distort. Actually, no, I'm sorry. It's not in the distort area. Excuse me. Let me go to texture right there, stained glass. Now, why do I like this? Because what it's doing is it's basically picking a single color in an area and saying, all right, I'm going to break that down into an individual stained glass cell. So what we can do here is we can make our cell size larger, and it'll start breaking down those colors into even larger sizes and basically start simplifying my image. I like to bring border thickness down as little as possible because I don't care about the borders. I also take out light intensity because light intensity adds this sort of fake glow in the middle to make it look like stained glass. We're not making stained glass here. We want this for another purpose. So I can bring my cell size way up if I want, but you can see I'm losing like that white blowout in the middle. So play around with where you end up with this. I find this would probably be good for me. So I'm going to hit OK. And now this is going to kind of be the basis for most of my color scheme. You could go a step further if you want, and then start picking individual colors in here that you want. So I can, for example, let's say I get a brush tool out. I can pick maybe 2 of these colors. Let's pick like this yellow, and then I'm going to pick one of these intense oranges here. That's too intense. And you can see all this stuff is getting very saturated. So maybe we'll go with something a little less intense in the oranges. There we go. Where was that? That guy? Perfect. And what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to paint out. I'm going to do it on the same layer. You can do it on a separate layer if you want. But I'm just going to paint out some of that orange. I'm going to switch my swatches, paint out some of that yellow, and then I'm going to grab my smudge tool, which you'll see. Man, I haven't used it in so long. Right here, there's the blur tool. I'm just going to use the smudge tool really quick and pick like I don't know, let's see what we have in here. There's a really great one. And if you look at your brushes in Photoshop, you'll see that there's these like little icons, right? Those are brushes right there. But if I go down a little bit further, see that little finger right there? This guy's going to help me blend this stuff out a little bit more texturally. And you can see now I'm starting to get sort of a gradient between my orange this way and my yellow here. And this gives me sort of an area of colors to work with. I can do the same with my blues. Let's pick a lighter blue. Let's see if we can find like a darker, maybe a darker blue purple, like that right there. I like that. And then let's paint both of these in just under here. So I'm going to start with like, let's say my purple on this side. And maybe, you know what, I'm going to bring this a little bit more intensely saturated. I want to go a little more intense with my purple in here. There's nothing wrong with that. And then we're going to switch to our blue. Paint that in here. I'm going to go back to my smudge tool up in here. Let's go back to, again, any one of these guys with that little finger icon next to them. You can also use regular brushes without that. I just like that this has a lot of nice texture to it, and it looks painterly. And just start blending between the colors. Drag your purple back and forth a little, drag the blues back and forth a little, and you'll end up with something. Now, you can see I lost some of the dark in there. I don't want to do that, so I'm going to do my best to try and not smudge that out too much. And I may come back in and say paint more of that blue in here to make sure I don't smudge it. Go back to my smudge tool and just start smudging between them there. So I keep some of that dark blue. I blend it into this lighter area. I blend the blues in here into the purples. And now I have like some nice gradients to pick from. So you can use any of these techniques for your colors, right? I'm actually going to just, for now, I'll leave that open. And I'm going to start with some of my oranges, right? So let's actually color sample a lighter orange in here. I'm going to turn off my colors in here. And now we're going to start doing some color application. So you can see I initially started with this red cylinder, and I'm realizing, you know what? That's not what I wanted to work with, right? So what can I do to fix this? Well, I can go to my image. I can go to adjustments. I'm going to do it through up here, image adjustments. I need to select the layer first. And I'm going to go to my hue saturation adjustment right here. This is probably one of the major adjustments I use all the time. You can see the shortcut for it is Control U, which is what I'm going to be using probably moving forward from here. So here we have the breakdown of our hue, our saturation, and our lightness, which make up our color, right? If I start dragging hue back and forth, you're going to see that my red just starts changing from red to purple to blues to teals. To this side, it'll start going into greens and yellows and back to oranges and then a red, right? So I can pick whatever color I want in here. I'm going to actually start with something in the oranges, right? Because that's one of my color schemes. So I'm going to drag it until it kind of gets close to that orange. If I want the orange to be more intense, I can drag my saturation up. Or if I want it to be less intense, I can drag it down. I'll probably keep it about where it was, maybe a little more saturated. And if I want the orange to be darker, I can drag it down. Or if I want it to be lighter, I can drag it up. I'll probably keep that about where it was as well. So I just switched that red to an orange, right? And here we have our cylinder color in our cylinder group. Now we're going to keep doing this throughout the scene, right? But first and foremost, probably the smartest thing to do would be, let's put a color in for our sky and our ground. I think that's probably going to be the most important thing. So based off of what we've been doing, I have a couple of options that I can use for my ground in here and for my sky, right? Let's start actually by the first option I'm going to do is I'm going to take my sky and duplicate it. I'm going to name this sky color. I'm going to turn off the old sky. We'll keep it in there just in case we need it. And I'm going to hit Control U. Remember, that is my hue saturation adjustment that I went to up here before. And what I'm going to do right here is I'm going to click this little colorize guy, because right now there's no color in that background. But if I do this, you can see it changed slightly, not a lot. If If I want to see more color in that, I'm going to have to start dragging my saturation up. And you'll see it's starting to turn a little orange, right? Let's actually darken it a little. And you can see it's getting more orange now, right? Now, I don't want my sky to really be an orange. First of all, I want my sky to go more towards the blue, right? So let's get to our blues, similar to kind of the blues and purples we were talking about. That's probably a nice sort of blue sky color in there. Probably not going to want it that saturated, maybe a little bit lower, but I do want to lighten it. Your sky is going to be your light source, so you want it to be kind of light. And that's already starting to look kind of like a nice daytime sky. Now let's also do the ground, right? So for the ground, I'm going to do something a little different. We're talking a little bit about atmospheric perspective this week. And with atmospheric perspective, we talked about it with value a little, but we're also going to talk about it with color, right? So your atmospheric perspective is going to build up blue as it goes into the background. If your sky color is blue, if you have purple in it, there'll be purple in it. If you have a green sky, it'll be green. So you want to build that up as you're going into the background. Now I'm going to start with, let's actually do ground color. I'm going to actually just start with the ground color first before I even think about atmospheric perspective. And I'm actually going to pick like a darker orange that I have in here, or if I want, I can bring up my color scheme. Right? Let's actually work within the one that we have in here. I'm going to pick one of these darker muted oranges, and then I'm going to pick, actually, I'm going to color sample the same orange, and I'm just going to kind of desaturate it and lighten it, because that's really what happens as things go into the background. The color gets less intense, and it's going to lighten and wash out. So going from my foreground darker orange to that more washed out one, I'm going to grab my paint bucket tool, but I'm going to hold, change it to the gradient. You want to look at your swatch up here and make sure that, I'll open up basic here, that it goes from one color to the other. So you want to make sure that that swatch is picked under basic. And then I'm going to go from my darker color to my lighter color up that way. I'm just going to hold shift, see what happens. That's not too bad. But I want that to be a little bit more gradual. So I'm actually going to hold shift and start lower and end higher. So it's just a little bit more gradual of a gradient. That works. So now I have a ground plane. I have a sky plane. Let's do one other thing. I'm immediately on top of here. I'm going to add in ground atmosphere. And this is the key, guys. You want to make sure that you're splitting up your elements so that they're not fighting with each other, right? And that you can adjust them individually. This is how things are going to work in compositing and rendering. Pretty much everything you do in 3D. So it's a good opportunity to do it in 2D while you have the chance, where it's actually a little more simplified. So now I'm actually going to color sample my sky color. And I don't want to really do anything else. I just want that color. And remember how I told you before we were going from one color swatch to the other here? Now I'm going to switch it to this one where it goes from blue to nothing to transparent. And now I'm actually going to go the opposite direction from the top here downwards. I'm going to hold shift. I'm just going to kind of create a nice long version of it, but I want to stop before I get to the foreground. So I'm going to go till right about here. And you can see it added a little bit of blue to that background there, right? And it makes it feel like it's really far back now. And that's how it should feel, because your horizon line is miles and miles and miles in the distance. It's like 30, 40, 50 miles. If you're on a mountaintop, it can be like hundreds of miles in the distance. So you want to make sure that you're building up enough atmosphere onto that ground plane as it goes off that far into the distance. And what we're going to do going forward is we're also going to do that on our forms to make them feel like they're going back. So I have my background set up now. Let's start moving into adding color to our shapes. Now, if you organize those multiply and overlay shadow and highlight layers correctly, this part should go pretty quickly. If you didn't, you're going to have to rearrange those layers to make this part go a little quickly, or you may have to rebuild those shadow and highlight layers to make sure it's working properly. So let's start with, we have our spheres in the background here. And then we also have seemingly a really large sphere on its own in my sphere 1 right here. So you know what? Let's start with sphere 1. This is kind of closer to our foreground, so we can have more saturated colors. But as we go further back, these colors will desaturate it. So again, let's do actually this instead. So you know how I have my sphere gray flat layer here? You can see if I turn it off, it becomes semi-transparent. I'm going to duplicate this layer, right? I'm going to rename it sphere color. There we go. Let's actually keep that organized, and instead of having weird capitals and lower cases, let's do it correctly. And now in here, let me first turn off sphere flat 1. I don't need that anymore. At least I don't need to see it. And then in my sphere color, I'm going to do that same, remember, image, adjustments, hue, saturation. In fact, I'm going to show you guys another way you can do that. I'm going to go right in here to this little It's a little ball with a half dark side, half light side. These are also adjustments that you can do, but these are going to attach to your layer and kind of sit on it. So you'll actually see here you have that same hue saturation, but you'll notice, right, the second I made that it kind of sat above the layer, right? Now, as I change this, you see how it's changing everything in the background? So that's a little bit of a problem, right? Another thing that I have to make sure, just like I showed you guys before, is I'm actually trying to change this right here. So I have to colorize this first, right? And now you'll see it made everything blue. But I only wanted to affect that sphere. So what you'll see here is there's this little guy with a box right here, and that's actually called your, it's a clipping mask. It'll essentially say, only make these adjustments happen on the layer right below it. If I turn this on, do you see how now it's just that sphere that's affected? There's another way to do this, by the way. You can actually hold Alt, and if you go between the two layers, you'll see nothing's happening right now, but I'm about to press Alt. And you see how that changed, and it looks like a little box with that arrow? Very similar to this box with an arrow I have here. You can turn that clipping mask on and off by doing this as well. So you'll notice that I've showed you a couple ways of doing the same things in Photoshop. This is how the software works, guys. Get comfortable with it. Learn one way that works for you, but eventually learn the other ways. They all have their kind of advantages and reasons. So now that I have my clipping mask on here, you'll notice I turned the sphere blue, right? But what if I don't want it to be blue? What if I want it to actually be more my oranges? Well, the nice thing about these layer adjustments, as opposed to doing it or up here, is they're not permanent. I can go back in, and if I double click this, it'll bring back up that adjustment, and I can keep changing it as I go forward. So I'm actually going to change this to an orange. Or actually, let's go just like a little bit more purpley, just slightly, not a ton. I'm going to kick up the saturation slightly, and I really like how that looks, so I'm happy with it. I can just close it, and those changes stay there. If I ever want to turn them off, I can just click on and off the adjustment layer. Or if I want to, adjust it again, double click on the little thumbnail here, not on this guy right here. All right, let's keep going, guys. And again, this is going to go pretty quickly because I set up my layers properly. So let's move on to, say, this cylinder right here. Is this cylinder 2? Yeah, let's go in here. I'm going to use the other technique. You're going to see me go back and forth between these techniques. I want to show you that, again, there are multiple ways to do this. I'll show you another way to do this, actually, guys. So I have my cylinder flat here, right? I am going to create a new layer here. I'm going to call it Cylinder 2 Color. And then within here, I'm just going to get my magic wand tool out up here. And I'm going to select on the outside, or I can just select the inside of my cylinder flat. And now I have those pixels selected. Now, you can see in some areas, some of my lines bled outside. Here, it's probably not going to be the case, but if you ever want to avoid that, after you get a selection, if you just go to Select, Modify, Contract, right? And now I'm going to bring my selection in, not by a lot, just by like 2 pixels. It got a little bit smaller, and now I can paint bucket in whatever color I want. Let's go back up to where I had my color swatches. I'm actually going to turn them on. I'm going to color sample. Start getting a little more yellows in here, right? So let's get something in this area here. You can turn that back off. Let's move this back down to here. You can also, by the way, if you hold spacebar in your image, you can like click and drag towards it. And then I'm just going to paint bucket in. I don't want a gradient. I want to switch this back to my paint bucket. I'm going to paint bucket in that yellow. And then I can just go to Select, Deselect, or again, hit Control D. I'm going to zoom out by, I can zoom out here, or the hotkeys Control minus will zoom out as well. And you can see I got that yellow in there. And this is going to keep happening as I keep going forward. Now, to me, that yellow ended up being a little too saturated. So I'm going to hit Control U to bring up my hue saturation adjustments. And because this is a little further back, I'm just going to start bringing the saturation of that yellow down. I'm actually just going to lighten it a little. Not too much, just a little bit. As I go further back, I'm going to start doing that a lot more. So let's keep working our way back. Let's go to our cone. I'm going to use another technique here where I took, remember that flat, I duplicated it. Let's rename it Color. I'm going to hit Control U. I'm going to colorize it. And I want this cone to be in my blues or my purples. So let's kick up the saturation so I can see what the color is more accurately. I'm probably going to darken it so I can see the color a little bit more as well. And then let's move until we get to our blues and purples. And I kind of like that blue right there. So I'm going to sit with that. And you'll see that the cast shadow from the cylinder affects the blue underneath it as well, because again, it's a multiply layer. I'm also actually going to come in, and I realize it's probably a little too saturated, so I'm going to kick the saturation down. I just hit Control U, and I'm kicking the saturation down. Maybe I'll lighten it a little bit. Not too much. I just don't want it to overpower what's in front of it. Keep working our way down, and I'm going to go to this floating cube up here. So in my cubes group, let's get to cube 1, right? Cube flat, duplicate it. Again, I'm just going to rename it cube 1 color. Let's use a layer adjustment again. So I'm going to click on this little ball right here and hit hue saturation. Now remember, I have to clip it to that cube 1 color. You have to make sure it's right above it. So I'm going to hit this little button right here. So it's only affected the color of this cube. I'm then going to hit colorize to make sure it adds color because it's in grayscale right now. And then to see that color more, I need to kick the saturation up. And we're going to leave this cube in sort of the yellow oranges. I like that a lot. Let's maybe darken it slightly so that color is a little more intense. So far, so good. Let's keep going, guys. Let's collapse cube 1. Let's go to cube 2. Lines on that one look fine. Again, same thing. And now here, I'm going to start getting a little more atmospheric perspective in it. So let's take our cube flat, duplicate it, cube 2, color, Control U, or again, we can do it by going to Image, Adjustments, Hue Saturation, where it's all the same thing in the end. We're just adjusting colors by adjusting hue, saturation, and lightness. So let's hit colorize. I'm going to keep this in the warms colors, but I'm going to go with more of an orange. And I'm going to start kicking up the saturation so I can make sure my orange is right. But then I'm actually going to keep it lighter. I'm going to probably lighten it up a little bit more as well. So it looks a little more washed out because it's pretty far back. Now, there's one other step that we're going to start doing now as these forms move back in space. I'm going to add in a new layer in here. I'm going to call this Cube 2 Atmosphere. And this is where I'm going to start adding those blue washes in. So we have a couple of ways we can do this. I'm just going to hold Control and click on the thumbnail here of the color layer, and you can see, I'm going to zoom in on it a bit, that it has that whole area selected. And now I'm going to select that blue sky background color. I'm also going to just use a brush, and now I'm going to use this soft round pressure opacity because I think that's going to give me the effect I need. And I'm just going to really lightly, sort of with a big brush, start adding some blue to this. And I'll probably go a little overboard, probably a little bit more blue on the top than I need on the bottom. And then if I want to soften it, I can pull out my eraser. I just hit E, soft, that's the hotkey for eraser, soft round pressure opacity, and then I can erase out, again, do this with a very big soft brown brush, maybe a little bit more of the bottom than the top. Now, I overdid this, and that's okay. Let's zoom back out. Because I put this on a separate layer so that I can come in, I'm going to deselect by hitting Control D, just so I can see it without the ants. I can come in and bring down the opacity, right? Not a ton, but just enough to say, hey, there's some sky building up on that, pushing it back a little bit. We'll have a lot more of that blue on these guys further back there, right? Now, before I keep going, actually, let's finish off our cube since we're in this group. Let's make the fix that I need to this cube now. So you can see I ended up with sort of that background outside of my cube area, right? So how am I going to fix this, right? I have my cube flat here. It sticks out too much. Shadow, highlight, cube lines, cube atmospheric perspective. So actually, what verged outside of there isn't any of my flat stuff. It's the atmosphere that I had already added in for value, right? So let's fix it. Let's get my magic wand tool out. Let's go to my lines group right there. I'm just going to select outside of it, right? So I selected the area outside of it. I'm not actually inside of it, just to show you. I'm going to zoom out. You can see I also have the ants on the outside, those little moving dots on the outside of my layer. So it's all this area in between, right? If I wanted to paint in here all of a sudden, I'm not going to be able to paint on the cube, just everywhere around it. Why does that help me? Because Control Z, there we go. Let's go back another step before I started painting. I can now move to that atmosphere layer where this ended up outside of it and just hit backspace. And it'll delete everything outside of those lines, right? Give me a pretty good result. There's a little bit of edge like issues with pixels in here. I'm not too worried about that, guys. That's totally fine. I don't need this to be perfect. But what we do want to do is let's keep fixing that also for our cube 4, which also seems to have similar issues. So let's go in here now, get our magic wand tool. Again, I'm going to go into the lines layer outside of it, and then I'm just going to move to that atmosphere layer, which I'm going to rename here actually. Let's name that Cube 4 Atmosphere so we keep these organized. I'm just going to hit backspace. And again, I ended up with a pretty good result. If you do want to clean up any more of this after, you can always come in with, like, for example, your hard round pressure size eraser, make it much smaller, zoom in and like kind of eat away at the little bits that you don't want in there. But to be honest, you're going to end up fighting back and forth a lot because of the dark lines and the atmospheric perspective lightness. So I wouldn't worry about it too much. Let's finish off the color for these guys as well. So for cube 3, right, let's say this one is a orange, or actually let's go with a blue for cube 3. Again, I'm going to take the flat, duplicate it. I'm going to hit Control U here. Well, before I do that, let's rename it Cube 3 Color. I'm going to hit Control U. And again, we're going to colorize it. It's already kind of in the orange area. I like that. I might just maybe bring it a little more to the yellow. I really don't need to add any more saturation to it with where it is, but maybe we'll bring it up just a little bit. The lightness looks fine. And now what I'm actually going to do is, so you see how that cube, the atmosphere I already had on there is what's washing it out, right? So I may have to turn that off and actually then again hit Control U and make adjustments here to maybe bring that saturation actually down a little bit, or the lightness up a little. Maybe keep my saturation where it was, but lighten this a little bit more. And then this cube atmospheric is going to wash it out in just white, but I want that to actually have some blue in it, right? So I have some options here. I can now hit Control U. I can colorize this, right? Let's actually kick up the saturation dramatically here so I can see what color I'm putting on it. And you can see here it's starting to get a little bluer, right? Or probably the easier thing to do here would be to just kind of get rid of my old atmospheric layer. I'm going to make a new one. I'm going to name it the same thing, Cube 3 Atmospheric. Not with all caps. I'm going to get a selection based off of my color. So I'm going to hold Control and select that area. That looks pretty good for the most part. Or if you want, you can go to your lines layer and use the magic wand and select outside, and then just invert your selection. So now it's inside the lines, right? So select inverse. Now you can see I'm in the lines area. I'm going to go into my cube atmospheric. Again, I'm just using the background sky color, and I'm just going to paint bucket it in. You'll see it went on there completely opaque. That's fine, because now I'm going to take that and start bringing the opacity of it down a lot. Not completely transparent. In fact, I do want to build it up more than I have here and more than I have in the foreground. So you can see it's giving me a little bit more. But that does a lot to push that back in space, right? And this is what we're going to keep doing. Cube 4. I'm going to just colorize this one for now and take it to the blue area. Let me just kick up the saturation a lot so I make sure it's the right shade of blue. You can probably lighten it a little bit, maybe kick it down a little. And that would probably work for what I need there, but I actually want that to be an orange. So I'm going to make, I duplicated my flat again, made it a color. I'm going to hit Control U. I'm going to colorize it, and I'm going to make it a orange yellow in here. Now you're not going to see a lot of that because it's so far back and it's so washed out that it barely shows up, right? It almost bleeds into the background. In fact, I'm going to take my cube atmosphere here, that's at 78%, and I need to start bringing that up. Now, to me, that's too light. It needs to get closer to that background color. So let's actually bring it to 100. And let's see if we can get it to match the background color, right? Kick up the saturation a little bit more. Gonna have to darken it a little bit. And this probably isn't the most efficient way of doing this, right? There's probably a way to get here that would be easier. Like I said, color sampling the background would probably be the easiest way, but that's pretty close. Now that's close enough. Now I can take this and lighten it. And you can see, as I start lightening it, it's like that cube looks like it's way off in the sky in the distance, right? And that's what we wanted to go for here. I'm actually going to go in, the cast shadow for that cube, I'm also going to lighten that. I have it at 100% right now, but that should be way lighter that far into the background. Same thing for some of the other cast shadows in here. So this, guys, is the process that essentially you guys are going to be going through to finish off your color schemes in here. I'm going to finally go through here as I'm talking here and just sort of finish up a little bit more of these guys. But I don't want to keep going through the same thing over and over again, because at this point I think you guys have a good understanding of how this process will work. But in the next video, I will kind of finish this off really quickly so you can see how it finished up. So guys, I hope having gone through this, you guys have a pretty good understanding of how to incorporate atmospheric perspective onto your forms, how to incorporate color into your forms, how to pick a color scheme to work with, and then how to work within the layers of Photoshop to actually make this process a lot simpler and a lot more adjustable. So I look forward to working with you guys moving forward, and I look forward to seeing what you guys come up with in this activity.